Prime Minister Narendra Modi is visiting Poland, and from there he goes to Ukraine. Now, an Indian Prime Minister has never visited the independent nation of Ukraine. And for many Indians, Ukraine is all about the war with Russia. But the relationship between the two countries dates back to the Soviet Union. The Russia-Ukraine war has impacted several areas of cooperation between the two countries: economy, education, and of course, military ties. Critical Indian defense equipment was made in Ukraine during the times of the Soviet Union. That dependence continues as those factories still make the spares for our transport aircraft, for our warships. These include the gas turbine engines for 16 of the Indian Navy's frontline warships and over 100 AN-32 transport aircraft operated by the Indian Air Force. Now, there are reports that Ukraine's state-owned Zorya is in talks with the Indian private sector companies to jointly manufacture gas turbines used by warships. The two countries are also discussing manufacturing aircraft and aero engines in India. Now, what is the import of these talks between India and Ukraine, and more importantly, why is Prime Minister Modi visiting Ukraine when it's literally at war with Russia? Joining me to discuss this are Major General Dhruv Katoch of the India Foundation and my colleague Aditya Raj Kaul in the studio with us. Gentlemen, welcome to the News9 Plus show. General Katoch, I want to start by asking you this. Why is Prime Minister Modi visiting a war zone? Ukraine is literally fighting a war with Russia. It's just launched a drone attack on Russia today. It's taken territory in the Kursk region of Russia. At a time like this, what is Prime Minister Modi doing in Kiev, where he will be in the next couple of hours?
Sandeep, I think it's a very high-risk mission. Even earlier, the British Prime Minister had gone to Ukraine, and even at that time, I thought it was a very high-risk mission to visit a country which is at war. That notwithstanding, I presume the appropriate security measures will be taken by the host country, as also I think the Russians will be aware of the program, and they will be circumspect in what they do. But in my view, the reason why this is taking place now, I think we are having both Russia and Ukraine come to a stage by which they are getting exhausted in the third year of the war which they are fighting.
Right.
When I look at it from the Ukraine's point of view, they are very concerned as to what is going to happen in the next US presidency, because should Donald Trump come in power,
Right.
he will cut off all financial aid to Ukraine, which will effectively bring the war to a close. The Europeans cannot fight it on their own.
Right.
From the Russian side, I think there are also concerns because it has been a strain on the Russian economy,
Yes.
and both sides I think are now looking at closure, but it has to be a respectable closure.
Right.
And I think that is where the nub of it lies. India is not in a position to actually force either of the countries. Why India? I think the world is not in a position to
Yes.
force either of the countries to a negotiating table.
Right.
But if you have an honest broker like India is
Yes.
an acceptable face to both Russia and to Ukraine. India is also an acceptable face to the United States and NATO. So I think when you're looking into that, with the Prime Minister's relationship with the President Putin,
Yes.
and he has also met President Zelensky, I think they have some element of faith in him that at least here is a person who is not going to sell us down the drain, to put it very, very bluntly.
Right.
So whether it leads to peace or not, I think
Yes.
that opportunity is there. And I think that is one of the major reason why the Indian Prime Minister is going there is to seize that opportunity. Of course, while doing so, there'll be other things also on the discussion table.
Right.
But I think this is going to be the prime reason why he's been there. He's already been to Russia, and now
Right.
this is the visit to Ukraine.
It sounds like a bit of a balancing act, General Katoch, that, a few weeks
Yes.
back, Prime Minister Modi was in Russia. The West, of course, frowned on that visit. And now a few weeks later, he's in Ukraine, where he's possibly going to be hugging, President Zelensky. But Aditya, tell us this. I was reminded of what Dr. Jaishankar said last year, where he said that Europe's problems are not the world's problems.
Absolutely.
Right? And today you have Prime Minister Modi in two of the most important European countries. First he goes to Poland and then he goes to Ukraine. What is the timing of this visit? What does it kind of indicate? Do you think it's more about seizing opportunities that General Katoch mentioned that are opening up there? Or is it possibly India playing an honest broker between Russia and Ukraine? It's friends with both countries, it has interests with both countries, and therefore it's seen as a reliable partner. What's the inside talk on this visit?
You know, Sandeep, one thing that puts India apart completely, very different from most of the countries, there are a couple of things. One
Yes.
is the Indian diplomacy.
Right.
What Jaishankar said, what Hardeep Singh Puri and others have reflected in the government, time and again, not just in European platforms, but interviews and spoken in New Delhi as well,
Yeah.
and said that, you know, you can't preach us.
Right.
You can't continue to preach us because we will show you the mirror.
Yes.
And that's what government of India has done
It's
over
more
the
about
last 3 years.
self-interest. It's about more interest,
If
India's
America, if the
self-interest,
Western
right.
countries can look inwards and perhaps see that over the last few decades,
Yeah.
their policy has been America first, you know, Europe first, then
Right.
why can't we look
Right.
the same way, look
Yes.
at our priorities, India first,
Right.
our independent, sovereign, policies
Right.
and priorities would remain the major focus.
Absolutely.
And secondly, of course, India's positioning
Yes.
since the beginning of the war has been that this is not an era of war.
Right.
Two, now Modi visiting Moscow last month and saying
Right.
that solutions cannot be found in a battlefield.
Absolutely.
This is incredible. You know, we haven't seen India touch such a staunch, independent positioning
Right.
and say to the world that no, we are not going to join one axis against the other.
Yes.
We have great traditional historical ties with Russia. We've been good in relationship with Ukraine.
Right.
You're right that in last more than 30 years, this is the first visit
Yes.
of an Indian Prime Minister to Ukraine.
Right.
After 45 years, after Morarji Desai, Prime Minister Narendra Modi for the first time visiting Poland.
Yes.
It's a huge message. Like, I mean, remember the time 2.5 years ago when Indians were stranded there.
Absolutely.
And 23,000 of them were rescued as part
Right.
of Operation Ganga.
Yeah.
And so India has played a significant role. India, although many people do not believe it and there are jokes doing around, but India did speak to, both Modi and Jaishankar spoke to Putin and Zelensky
Yes.
and said that our people are trapped.
Right.
We need to rescue them. You need to have a humanitarian pause.
Absolutely.
And that's how in Kharkiv,
Yes.
there was a humanitarian pause and people were brought in and rescued. So now it comes at a time when, as rightly put by General Katoch,
Right.
there's this fatigue, there is an exhaustion now.
Absolutely.
And they are looking in the next 6 months or so that there should be some closure, there should be an
Yes.
end to a war, but both sides are reluctant
Right.
to concede and want some kind of a respectable closure. So can India play that predominant role of a
Yes.
leader in this age? Because you saw a G20 consensus also being arrived last year. So why not? Prime Minister Modi certainly will, put out such messages both from Poland and Ukraine. And many would say that this is a balancing act. That may be fair. That's okay.
Yes.
I mean, India wants peace at the end of the day,
Yeah.
even if
Now-
at the question of a balancing act.
Yes, absolutely. And now it's not an era of war, as the Prime Minister said. But, it's also about India first. And that's been the consistent policy of this government in the last couple of years. But apart from the India first policy, there's also an armed forces first policy that India would be keen to pursue when it comes to Russia and the former Soviet bloc countries. And Ukraine is very critical, as I mentioned, for reasons of equipment that have been sourced historically from the regions of Ukraine, which manufactured aircraft engines and warship engines. And General Katoch, Ukraine has also been a very key defense supplier to New Delhi. First, because of the legacy platforms that we've operated from the time of the Soviet Union. You have the AN-32s, 105 of them that were bought from Ukraine. They're literally the workhorse of the Air Force. And we were doing the math today. It's 16 frontline warships of the Indian Navy. That's literally 90% of the Indian Navy's warship fleet are driven by Ukrainian gas turbine engines. Now, how critical is this for two of our three armed forces? The fact that you have such a large number of platforms that come from Ukrainian defense companies. How important will this be when the Prime Minister begins his talks with President Zelensky?
Well, I think every bit as far as defense is concerned is important, but we must remember that over the last decade, a lot of indigenization has taken place and our dependency to a very large extent has reduced on foreign supplies. And that goes especially for the Indian Navy also. So while the legacy equipment is there and we will still be dependent upon Ukraine and on Russia for certain supplies for the Air Force, for the Navy and also for the Army, I don't think the criticality is there to the extent which it was earlier. However, if peace comes into, if we finally have peace between Russia and Ukraine,
Yes.
then the situation will certainly improve. But should they continue to fight, I think we will carry on. It is not critical to India, but it is important to India. Let me put it that way.
It's not.
And so, to that extent, I think India will be looking for a peaceful solution, or at least a ceasefire to take place. And while there may be outward hostility, but at least the guns won't be firing. And to that extent, I think if we can work towards that, that should be all right for us.
Right.
But regardless of anything, I think our defense capability, we have looked after it. So that won't matter to the extent it would have about a decade ago.
Right, absolutely. And the guns need to stop firing, General Katoch, as you mentioned. Aditya, that ceasefire that you mentioned during that very historic airlift of Indian students, is there any possibility that, is it even being discussed on the table, the fact that India could be an honest broker between Ukraine and Russia? Has that been raised by the MEA in the last couple of weeks?
If India says this,
Yeah.
if New Delhi takes that position, then one would say that India is trying to become a world leader, and
Right.
Prime Minister Modi is perhaps going for a Nobel Peace Prize. But it is the Ukrainian ambassador.
Yes.
In fact, Ukrainian ambassador in the media has said
Right.
that Modi and India, as the leader of the global South,
Yeah.
can play a very significant and predominantly important role
Right.
in brokering peace. So this is a reality. I would give you an example that we spoke last year during the G20. In the days to the G20, it was increasingly unlikely, especially from the Western
Yes.
press and foreign policy wonks, that there would be no consensus.
Right.
And even though diplomacy does not matter so much when there is an active war
Yes.
taking place, but it was significant.
Right.
The joint statement, the consensus on Ukraine and Russia was significant, and that happened in New Delhi. So Prime Minister Modi, with the way he has positioned himself
Right.
and India, and Jaishankar's foreign policy approach and direct speak
Yes.
is quite significant. And as you mentioned, apart from this, there is a whole lot of bandwidth of bilateral ties
Yes.
that are going to be discussed in the defense sector. The JV in gas turbines of the Indian
Yes,
Navy,
yes.
gas turbine engines, is
Right.
a significant step forward.
Absolutely.
And perhaps we'll see some light at the end of the tunnel.
Absolutely. The joint venture with Zoria Mash Project, as it's pronounced, the Ukrainian company that powers like literally 90% of the Indian Navy's frontline destroyers and frigates. It's a very large number. So I'm sure a joint venture like this with that Ukrainian company would, alleviate our fears of a cut if there is, if the war spreads, if, it could possibly disrupt these supplies to our warships, naval warships, critical warships. This is, obviously they didn't think of this contingency at the time when these deals were signed back then in the 90s.
True.
That, you would be looking at a full-scale war between Russia and Ukraine. But General Katoch, when this visit was doing the rounds, with talks of Prime Minister Modi's visit to Ukraine were doing the rounds, the Russia-Ukraine war was kind of on a slow burn. It wasn't the kind that's in the last couple of hours, what has happened, or last couple of days, Aditya. Ukraine has launched a full-scale offensive into Kursk. That's Russian territory. They've captured over 400 kilometers. They've captured a lot of Russian prisoners who they want to exchange for in case there is ceasefire talks. And you have Russia pushing ahead in the Donbas region. And today you have a massive, massive drone strike that the Ukrainians have launched, over 40 drones against Russian territory. This points to an escalation of the conflict itself. Do you think that the timing of this visit, Prime Minister Modi's visit, when he lands in Kiev, well, he actually rolls into Kiev in that railway line.
Yes.
I mean, the
Rail Force One.
Rail Force One as he's taking. When he drives into Kiev in that railway engine, do you think that kind of takes away from a lot of, the sensitivity of this visit? The fact that you have a full-scale war that's going on. It's not just what it was on the back burner a few days back. Today it's like, you have Ukrainian forces fighting on the territory of Russia. You have, of course, Russia pushing deep into Donbas, and there are cruise missile strikes, drone strikes, all of that. It points to an escalation in the conflict. How do state visits usually take place when there are full-scale wars of the kind that we've been seeing in the last couple of days? Tell our viewers this.
Russians were attacking earlier, and Ukraine was actually on the defensive.
Yes.
And there was, I thought there was some sort of an explicit understanding or a thought process within the Russian armed forces that
Right.
Ukraine will never attack Russian territory.
Yes.
And should they do so, it'll be treated as tremendous escalation.
Right.
I think the Russians are tired also now, and
Yes.
the Ukrainians wanted to say, listen, we can actually hit Russia also, and if
Right.
required, we will do so. Now, this is the larger danger here is not between what is going to happen between Russia and Ukraine. It is really, will the conflict spread across to NATO? And then, of course, we don't know which way it will go. I think over a long term, the Ukrainians will not be able to sustain what they are doing. Capturing territory and getting into a place is relatively easy. Sticking on there and holding on to it is a very, very difficult task. That is what the Russians have experienced also. I was quite certain that if Russia wishes to capture Ukraine, they could have captured the whole territory. They couldn't have held on to it. And now I'm realizing that even the portion which they have captured, largely it is Russian speaking people who are, the entire belt which they have got is Russian speaking, and the rest have been pushed out. So they have a population base there which is supportive of them. But when you're looking at Ukraine's entry into the Kursk area, the population is not supportive as far as Ukraine is concerned, and they are going to have problems in the long term, or even in the short term, I will say. But it is a good bargaining chip. So now the Ukrainians can tell the Russians, listen, we want back something, we'll give you something, and there will be some sort of, it is possible that you can have a compromise. The Russians are not going to cede everything, but I think they will cede much more now than what they would have ceded earlier. So to that extent, I think what the Ukrainians are doing, that is the way their thought process has gone. For the Russians, I think they can still save face and have a compromise and retain a large part of what they have captured. And we are in a position to get onto a truce. But ultimately, it will also depend upon what the United States thinks, what not NATO thinks, and if the US wants to continue to progress the war.
Yes.
There was a chance of a ceasefire even 2 years back, but Britain actually dissuaded Ukraine from doing so.
Yes.
So that would have been, of course, on US instructions. So there was a larger game plan being played on Ukrainian territory by Western forces. I think even the West is tired now. So perhaps we can come to some sort of an arrangement. And despite the fact that this offensive has gone in now,
Yes.
I think it is the right time for the Indian Prime Minister to be there and be in a position to talk to both sides.
Absolutely. The timing of this visit, very interesting as put by General Katoch, the fact that Prime Minister Modi lands at a time when both sides have been fighting for 3.5 years now without a respite. And who knows, this could be the start of a new peace process in Ukraine, a permanent ceasefire. Who knows what could transpire in the next couple of hours, but that's a story we'll be watching very carefully. Prime Minister Modi's mission Ukraine. Thank you for joining us, General Katoch. My colleague Aditya Raj called. That's a story that's on everyone's radar as Prime Minister Modi drives into Kyiv over the next couple of hours.